Her name was Iris, and she was 7 years old, and she had the kind of face that made strangers want to smile at her in the street. The kind of face that was open and large-eyed and full of expression in every feature except the one that most people used most of the time, which was the mouth, and the mouth had been quiet for 3 years. Now quiet in the way that is different from shy or reserved, or thoughtful quiet in the way that means something happened, and the something that happened had reached into a small person and turned off a switch that the people around her did not know how to turn back on, and she lived in a large house in a quiet neighborhood in Chicago with her father, who was a man named Gerald Holt, and Gerald ran financial consulting firm downtown, and he was the kind of man who was very good at his work and less certain about everything else, and the house they lived in together was beautiful in the way that houses are beautiful when someone with money and no time has hired other people to make all the aesthetic decisions, and every room was correct and nothing was out of place, and the whole thing had the feeling of a space that was being maintained rather than lived in, and there was a difference between those two things that Iris understood in her body, even if she did not have the words for it at 7, and the words had been going away since she was 4, which was the year her mother died, and the year the house had started to feel like what it felt like now, which was a place that was waiting for something to come back that was not coming back, and Gerald had done everything a person in his position could think to do. He had taken Iris to a pediatric neurologist, and then to a child psychologist, and then to a speech and language therapist, and then to a specialist at a hospital 2 hours away, who had a particular focus on childhood trauma responses, and each of these people had given Iris assessments, and each assessment had produced a folder, and the folders lived in Gerald's home office in a neat row on the shelf above his desk, and they represented a significant amount of money and a significant amount of hope and a significant amount of disappointment, because the thing that none of the folders had produced was the sound of his daughter's voice, and the clinical name for what had happened to Iris was selective mutism with a trauma component, which meant that the silence was not a physical problem. It was the result of something the mind had decided to do in response to something unbearable, and the something unbearable had been losing her mother suddenly and without warning on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when Iris was 4 years old, and her mother had been 31 and healthy, and then she had not been, and Iris had been in the house when it happened, and the details of that afternoon lived in Gerald's chest like something he could not put down and could not look at directly, and could only carry forward, and the house after that afternoon had become quieter and quieter, not all at once, but gradually, the way light fades in the evening, not by disappearing but by thinning until you realize it is gone, and Gerald had not known how to stop the fading, because he was a man who understood financial systems and client management and strategic planning, and he did not understand grief, and he especially did not understand the grief of a 4-year-old who had stopped speaking and who looked at him with eyes that asked him something he could not answer, and the house had gone through 4 housekeepers in 3 years, and the turnover was not because Gerald was cruel. He was not cruel, he was exacting and distracted. And the house was demanding, and the quiet was the kind of quiet that accumulated in you over weeks and months and made people who had not chosen it want to leave, and the first housekeeper had lasted 4 months and had given notice in a polite letter that said she was pursuing other opportunities, and the second had lasted 6 months and had left when Gerald had criticized a detail of the household management in a way that was accurate but not kind, and the third had lasted only 2 months because she had found the silence around Iris frightening in a way she could not explain, and had said as much to the agency, and the fourth had been efficient and capable and had lasted almost a year before a family situation had required her to relocate, and Gerald had called the agency again, and the agency had sent Dora, and Gerald had interviewed Dora the way he interviewed everyone, which was with a list of requirements and a clear outline of expectations and a manner that was professional and left little room for anything personal. and Dora had sat across from him in the front room and listened and answered his questions directly, and he had told her about the household routine and the grocery ordering system and the laundry schedule and the cleaning requirements, and then he had said there is a child, and Dora had said yes. The agency mentioned, and he had said she does not speak, and he had said it. The way he said most things about Iris, which was as a fact reported from a distance, because reporting it from a distance was the only way he had found to say it without it costing him something in front of a stranger, and Dora had nodded and she had not said how terrible or what a shame or any of the things people usually said, and she had not asked what the clinical name was or how long it had been or whether there was hope of improvement, and she had simply nodded the way you nod when someone tells you something factual that you are going to take seriously. And Gerald had noted the absence of the usual response without knowing what to do with it, and he had offered her the position, and she had accepted, and she had started the following Monday, and Iris had met Dora for the first time at the kitchen table on that Monday morning, where she always sat in the mornings in the particular spot that was hers, which was the chair that faced the window, because she liked to look at the garden, and she was sitting there with a bowl of cereal that she was not eating, and her hands were in her lap, and her eyes were on something outside the window that may or may not have been anything, and Dora had come into the kitchen with her bag and the agency paperwork, and she had said good morning in the same voice she used for everything, which was plain and unhurried, and not pitched at a child, the way adults pitched their voices at children who were understood to need handling, and Iris had not responded, which Dora had accepted without a pause, or a changed expression, or a second attempt, and she had set her bag down and looked around the kitchen the way you look around a kitchen when you are learning it, and she had asked Gerald, who was standing in the doorway with his briefcase, if there was a particular place he kept the cleaning supplies, and Gerald had told her, and she had nodded, and he had said goodbye to Iris in the careful way he said goodbye to her every morning, which was gently and without expectation of a response, and he had left, and the house had become Dora's and Iris's, and Dora had begun to move through it, and Iris had sat at the table for a while longer, and then she had gotten down from her chair, and she had done something she had not done with any of the previous 4 housekeepers, which was follow Dora down the hall and stand in the doorway of the room Dora was working in and watch her, and Dora had not made anything of this. She had simply continued what she was doing and spoken in her plain, unhurried way about what she was doing, the way some people talk to themselves when they work, and Iris had stood in the doorway and watched, and the house around them was quiet, but it was a different quality of quiet than it had been that morning when Gerald was in it, and even on that first day, even in the first hours of a new person entering a house that had grown accustomed to disappointing everyone who tried to make things better inside it. Something was different, and the difference did not have a name yet and could not have been written in any of the folders on the shelf in Gerald's home office, but it was there in the doorway, where a 7-year-old girl stood watching a woman who had not flinched at her silence, and the winter light came through the hallway window and lay across the floor between them, and the house held its breath, the way houses do when something is beginning. The second week was when Iris started following Dora into every room, and not just standing in doorways, but actually coming inside and sitting somewhere near where Dora was working and watching the way she watched everything, which was with a completeness of attention that most adults could not sustain for more than a few minutes, but that Iris held for long stretches without apparent effort, and Dora had noticed this quality of attention in the child early and had understood it for what it was, which was not passivity and not vacancy, but a kind of very active internal processing that was happening behind eyes that appeared still, and she had adjusted how she moved through the house accordingly, not in a calculated therapeutic way, but in the natural way of a person who was aware of being observed and who had nothing to hide, and so did not behave differently under observation than they did without it. And this quality in Dora was something Iris had no word for, but that Her body registered as safe in the particular way that children's bodies register safety, which is not through reasoning, but through something older and more reliable than reasoning. And the mornings had developed a shape that had not been planned by anyone. They had simply formed the way shapes form when two people exist in the same space long enough without forcing anything, and the shape was this. Dora arrived and made the kitchen ready, and Iris came downstairs and sat in her chair by the window, and Dora made her a proper breakfast, not the cereal that Iris half ate every morning, but actual food that required preparation. And the first time Dora had made scrambled eggs and put them in front of Iris, the little girl had looked at the plate and then looked at Dora, and Dora had said, "I looked in the fridge and eggs seemed like the right idea." And she had gone back to what she was doing. And Iris had eaten the entire plate, and that had been noted without comment, and from then on Dora made real breakfasts, and Iris ate them, and Gerald had noticed that his daughter was finishing her meals, but had not yet asked. Why? Because asking would have required him to be present in the kitchen in the mornings, and he was not present in the kitchen in the mornings. He was moving through the house toward the door with his briefcase and his mind already at the office, and Dora had been in the house for 2 weeks before. Gerald had a conversation with her that lasted more than 4 minutes, and the conversation had been practical on his side, about a grocery order, and she had answered practically, and he had gone, and she had continued, and the days were Dora and Iris's, and in those days something was growing that was too quiet and too slow to be noticed from the outside. But that was real in the way that quiet, slow-growing things are real, which is completely and in every direction at once, and Dora had a way of filling space with language that was not directed at Iris and not designed to draw her out, but that simply existed in the rooms alongside, or the way background music exists in the space, and changes the feeling of it without anyone needing to consciously register it. And she would talk about what she was doing while she was doing it in a running narration that was conversational, without requiring a conversational partner, and she might say something like, "This window catches more light than the others. I wonder if whoever built this house knew that, or if they just got lucky." And she would not look at Iris when she said it, and she would not pause for a response. She would just continue, and Iris would sit nearby and listen, and the listening was total, and Dora could feel it the way you can feel genuine attention in a room, even when the person giving it is not speaking. And one morning in the 3rd week, Dora was reorganizing the pantry, which was a task that had clearly not been done systematically in some time, and she was talking about the logic of pantry organization in the way she talked about everything, which was as if the subject was genuinely interesting to her, which it was, because Dora found most things genuinely interesting if she looked at them long enough. And she said something about how everything needed a place that made sense for how it was actually used, not just a place that looked right when the door was closed. And she heard from the corner of the kitchen, where Iris had been sitting on the floor with her back against the cabinet, a small sound, and the small sound was not a word, and it was not language, but it was not nothing. Either it was the sound a person makes when something they have heard connects with something they already know, and it was the sound of a child who was listening so hard that the listening had momentarily become audible, and Dora had kept her back to the corner and kept reorganizing the pantry and kept talking, and the door that had made that small sound stayed open, and Dora understood without having been told and without having read any of the folders on Gerald's shelf that the worst thing she could do in that moment was turn around. And the 2nd week became the 3rd, and the 3rd became the 4th, and Gerald came home in the evenings to a house that was clean and orderly, and where his daughter had eaten her meals and was in her room, with the door not entirely closed, which was different from how it had been before, when the door was always entirely closed. And he had noted these differences the way he noted most things in his personal life, which was from a distance, and without fully entering them, because fully entering them required him to also enter other things that lived in the same space, and he was not yet ready for that. and Dora had been respectful of his distance, not because she thought the distance was right, but because she understood that pushing people toward things they were not ready for was how you made them retreat further, and she was patient in the long way that people are patient when they understand that some things cannot be rushed and only suffer from the attempt. And on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week, Gerald had come home earlier than usual because a meeting had ended, and he had walked into the house and followed the sound of something he had not heard in 3 years, which was a sound from Iris that was not silence, and he had stopped in the hallway outside the kitchen and listened, and Dora was in the kitchen, and Iris was in the kitchen, and Dora was talking about something she was making for dinner, and in the space between her sentences there were small sounds from Iris, and the small sounds were not yet words, but they were the sounds that come before words, the sounds of a person relearning that their voice exists, and it is safe to let it exist. And Gerald had stood in that hallway and pressed his back against the wall, and he had not gone in, and he had not made a sound, and he had stood there for several minutes, and the sounds continued. And when he finally moved away from the wall and went to his office, he sat at his desk for a long time without opening his laptop, and he looked at the folders on the shelf, the row of them with their clinical names and their assessments and their second opinions, and he thought about what he had just heard in the hallway, which was his daughter's voice beginning to come back, not because of anything in those folders, but because a woman who had come from a small town in Indiana and who had been doing domestic work for 8 years, had walked into his kitchen and talked to his daughter the way you talk to someone when you are not trying to fix them, and he sat with that for a long time, and the office was quiet around him and outside the window. The Chicago afternoon was doing its ordinary things, and somewhere in the house his daughter was making sounds that were not yet words, and Gerald Holt, who was precise and capable and accustomed to problems that had solutions, sat at his desk and felt the particular feeling of a man who's been looking in the wrong place for a very long time and has just understood that and does not yet know what to do with that understanding. And the house around him was the same house it had always been, and it was also completely different, and the difference was something he could feel in his chest in the place where he kept the things he could not put down and could not look at directly and outside. Iris's small sounds continued, and Dora's voice moved through the kitchen like something that had always belonged there. And the late afternoon light came through the windows and lay across the floors of the house that had been waiting for 3 years for exactly this. The sounds that Iris was making were not yet words, but they were becoming something, and Dora could hear the shape of language underneath them the way you can hear the melody of a song underneath an imperfect humming of it. And she did not comment on the sounds, and she did not encourage them with the kind of bright, excited energy that adults used when children did things they were hoping for, because she understood that bright, excited energy in response to something fragile was how you taught a person that the fragile thing was being watched and monitored. And when something fragile understood who's being watched and monitored, it often went back into hiding, and Iris had been in hiding for 3 years, and Dora was not going to be the reason she went back, and so she received the sounds the way she received everything, which was as a natural part of what was happening between them without assigning them more weight than the moment asked for. And the 5th week arrived, and the Chicago winter was at its most serious outside. The house with the kind of cold that made the windows fog at the edges and the radiators work overtime, and the light, when it came at all, came low and gray. And Dora had started lighting the lamp in the kitchen in the mornings earlier than the season technically required, because she had noticed that Iris was more present in rooms that had warm light in them rather than the flat overhead light that Gerald had left on in every room. And small things like that were the things Dora paid attention to, the kind of things that did not appear in any folder, but that were the actual texture of how a person was doing. And Iris had started sitting closer to Dora as the weeks went on, not dramatically closer, not in a way that announced itself, but incrementally, the way trust moves, which is in very small steps that are only visible When you look at the distance between where you started and where you are now, and by the 5th week, Iris was sometimes sitting close enough that if Dora turned around, she would be right there. And Dora had not turned around suddenly, or without warning. She had developed a habit of announcing her movements in advance, the way she might say, "I am going to turn around now to get the flour," and Iris would adjust, and the adjusting was wordless and smooth and part of the daily choreography of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. And one morning, in the 5th week, Dora was at the kitchen table with a piece of paper, working out the week's grocery list, and she was talking through the list as she wrote it in the way. She talked through everything, and she said something about whether she should make a soup that week, because the cold outside seemed like it was asking for a soup, and she was thinking the kind with bread to go with it. And from behind, or very close behind her, there was a sound that was different from the other sounds, and Dora went still the way you go still when something significant is happening and you do not want to disrupt it with your own movement. And the sound came again, and it was not quite a word, but it was closer to a word than anything that had come before it, and it had the shape of yes. And Dora said without turning around, yes to the soup, and she heard a small sound that had the quality of confirmation. And she wrote soup on the list and kept writing, and the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was on, and the gray winter light pressed against the windows from outside. And Dora's hand moved across the paper, and inside that ordinary moment something had shifted in a way that was not ordinary at all. And the days continued, and the sounds continued to move toward language, the way something moves toward a shape it has always had, but temporarily lost. And Gerald was aware that something was different in the house. He could feel it when he came home in the evenings, in the way the air felt different, and in the way Iris was sometimes in the kitchen when he arrived, rather than in her room, which had been her pattern for 3 years. And he did not know what to do with her presence in the kitchen, because he had spent 3 years learning how to be with her silence, and her presence in the kitchen meant something was changing, and he did not yet know the shape of the change, and so he was careful around it, the way he was careful around most things he did not understand. And Dora had watched him be careful around it, and she had not pushed him toward anything. She had simply continued. And one evening Gerald had come home, and Dora was still there later than usual, because she had been finishing something in the garden. And he had said, "You did not need to stay." And she had said, "I know." And he had said, "Thank you for what you are doing with her." And he had said it looking at the counter, not at her. The way he said things that cost him something. And she had said, "I am not doing anything particular." And he had looked at her then and said, "That is not true." And she had met his eyes and said, "I am just here with her." And he had said, "That is the thing." And he had not said anything else. And she had finished what she was finishing and gone home, and Gerald had stood in his kitchen and looked at the space where Dora had been standing and thought about what it meant that 3 years of folders and assessments and specialists had not done what a woman who was just here had begun to do. And the thought was not comfortable, but it was honest, and he sat with it, the way he was learning to sit with things, which was imperfectly and with effort. And the 6th week brought something Dora had been moving toward slowly, which was the garden. And she had started spending time in the back garden on the afternoons when the cold eased enough to make it possible. And the garden had been maintained at a basic level by a service that came every few weeks, but it had not been genuinely tended in a long time. And there was a difference between maintained and tended that Dora understood in the same way she understood the difference between a house that was being survived and a house that was being lived in. And she had asked Gerald if she could do some proper work in the garden, and he had said yes, without asking what she meant by proper. And she had started, and Iris had followed her outside on the 3rd day, and had sat on the cold garden step, wrapped in her coat, and watched Dora work in the soil. And Dora had talked about what she was doing the way she always talked, and she had talked about what the garden needed, and what it had been, and what it could be. And she had talked about the particular stubbornness of plants that had been neglected which was that they often had more in them than they appeared to, because they had spent their neglected time developing root systems that nobody had been paying attention to, and she had said this without looking at Iris, and without intending it as anything other than a fact about plants, and Iris had been sitting on the step and listening, and Dora had been kneeling in the soil with her hands in it when she heard something behind her, and the something was a sound that stopped her hands, and the sound was a word, and the word was small, and it had been unused for 3 years, and it had the quality of something finding its way back to the surface after a long time underground. And the word was there, and Dora heard it, and she kept her hands in the soil, and she did not turn around, and she said the word back in the same ordinary tone she used for everything, as if the word had always been part of their conversations. And then she kept talking about the garden, and her hands kept moving in the soil, and behind her on the cold step, Iris was very still in the way that people are still when they have just done something significant and are waiting to find out whether the world changed because of it, and the world had not changed visibly because Dora had made sure of that. And the garden was the same garden, and the cold was the same cold, and Dora's voice was the same voice, and everything was exactly as it had been before the word, except that it was also completely different, and the word had been small, and it had been one syllable, and had been the most important thing that had happened in that house in 3 years. And Dora finished what she was doing in the soil, and she said, "I think that is enough for today." And she stood up and she turned around and she looked at Iris, and Iris looked at her, and Dora said, "What do you think?" And Iris looked at the garden and then back at Dora, and she made a sound that had the shape of agreement, and Dora said, "Good," and she picked up her tools and said, "Let us go in and have something warm," and she walked to the door and held it open, and Iris got up from the step and walked through it, and the door closed behind them, and the garden sat in its cold winter quiet, and in the soil where Dora had been working, something that had been there all along was beginning to find its way to the surface. The word had been there, and now it was out in the world, and the world had not made too much of it, which was the most important thing, and Iris had tested that in the days that followed, the way children test things they are not sure of yet, which is carefully and from a slight distance, and she had made sounds that were closer to words, and some of them had become words quietly and without announcement, and each time a word arrived, Dora had received it the same way she received everything, which was as a natural part of what was happening, and not as a miracle to be documented or a breakthrough to be celebrated loudly, because Dora understood that celebrating loudly was for the adults and not for the child, and the child was the one doing the work, and the child's work deserved to be taken seriously rather than applauded, and the words were coming back in the order that made sense, which was not the order of importance, but the order of safety, and the first safe words were the practical ones, the ones that answered questions and completed exchanges and did not require Iris to put anything of herself into them, and Dora had created many small opportunities for those words without making the opportunities look like opportunities, and she might ask a question that had a one-word answer while she was looking at something else entirely, and Iris would answer, and the answer would be received. And life would continue, and the exchange would not be turned into a moment, and the not turning it into a moment was the thing that kept the words coming, and the 7th week arrived. And the words were more frequent, and Gerald was still not fully aware of how frequent, because the words mostly happened in the hours that belonged to Dora and Iris, and the hours that belonged to Gerald were the evenings when Iris was quieter and more guarded, and this was not a mystery to Dora, because she understood that Iris and Gerald were caught in something together that neither of them knew how to get out of, which was a grief they had both been carrying alone in the same house for 3 years, and the grief had become the air between them, and they had both learned to breathe around it without addressing it, and the words that were coming back to Iris were not yet ready to travel through the air between her and her father, and Dora was patient about that, and she did not try to engineer a moment between them, because engineered moments were for people who did not trust the natural ones, and she trusted the natural ones, and the natural ones were coming, and Gerald had begun to spend a little more time in the kitchen in the evenings. Not a lot, just slightly longer than he used to, and sometimes he would stand at the counter with a glass of water and ask Iris a simple question, and Iris would look at him, and the looking was different from how it had been before. It had less of the sealed quality and more of the quality of someone who was considering whether to open something, and Gerald was patient with that consideration in his way, which was not Dora's way, but was his own version of the same instinct, and Dora had watched this from a respectful distance and had said nothing to Gerald about it, because saying something to Gerald about it would have made it a project. And it was not a project, it was a father and his daughter finding their way back toward each other through the very small door that was currently available. And then the morning came that Dora had not planned and had not anticipated, which was the Thursday in March when Gerald's meeting was canceled, and he came home at 10, and the house was quiet from the front, and he had set his bag down in the hallway and heard something from the back of the house, and the something was Dora's voice in the garden, and he had walked through the kitchen toward the back door and looked through the kitchen window, and what he saw had stopped him completely, and he had stood there with his hand not quite reaching the door handle, and he had not been able to move, and what he was seeing was Iris sitting beside Dora on the low garden bench that had been there since before his wife died, and Dora was doing something with a small pot of soil. She was repotting something from the garden's winter stock, and she was talking in the way she always talked, and Iris was beside her, and Iris was talking too, and the talking was not the almost sounds and the shaped silences. It was actual words in actual sentences, and they were not long sentences, and they were not complicated ones, but they were sentences, and they were coming from his daughter's mouth in her voice, which was a small voice and a slightly uncertain one, from years of disuse, but which was entirely and completely hers. And Gerald stood at the kitchen window with his hand not quite reaching the door handle, and he felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a name for, and that was larger than anything he had felt since the day his wife died, and in some ways it was a similar feeling, not because it was sad in the same way, but because it was the feeling of something enormous and irreversible happening to you while you are standing still, and the enormity of it not fitting into any normal-sized moment. And he stood there, and he watched, and Dora was talking about the pot and the soil and what she was putting in it, and Iris was asking a question, and the question was small and practical, and it was about whether the plant would grow back in the spring, and Dora said yes it would, and it would probably come back stronger because it had had a hard winter. And that was often how things worked with plants that had been through something difficult. And Gerald heard that and looked at his daughter's face as she listened to it. And Iris's face was open in a way he had not seen it open in 3 years. And he pressed his hand flat against the cold kitchen glass, and the cold went through his palm, and he felt it as a physical thing that helped him stay present, because the alternative was to not be present, and he needed to be present for this. And then Iris looked up, and she saw him through the window, and he was not prepared for what happened next, which was that she did not stop, and she did not close, and she did not retreat into herself, the way he had come to expect when he appeared unexpectedly in her space, and instead, she looked at him through the glass, and she said something, and the something she said was a word, and the word was the word that children own before any other word, and the word was the one she had not said to him in 3 years, and the word was Dad, and it was small, and it was uncertain at the edges, the way things are when they have been unused, but it was the word, and it was his, and Gerald's hand was still flat against the cold glass, and he felt the word move through the glass and through his palm, and into his chest, and he could not speak, and he could not move, and his eyes were doing something he had not allowed them to do in front of anyone in 3 years, and Dora had heard the word. And she kept her eyes on the pot in her hands, and she did not look at the window, and she did not say anything, and she gave the moment The space it needed to be what it was, which was everything. And Gerald lifted his hand from the glass and he opened the back door, and the cold March air came into the kitchen behind him, and he walked out into the garden, and Iris looked at him, and he walked to the bench, and he sat down beside her, not on Dora's side, but on Iris's other side, and the three of them sat there for a moment in the garden in the cold March morning, and Dora kept her hands moving in the soil, because hands that were moving in the soil were an anchor for the moment and an indication that ordinary life was continuing around. The extraordinary thing that was happening inside it, and Gerald looked at his daughter, and she looked back at him, and he said hello in a voice that was not his professional voice or his careful voice, but a voice that had come from somewhere much further back than either of those, and Iris looked at him, and she said hello back, and the garden was quiet around them, and the winter soil was dark in Dora's hands, and somewhere above the gray Chicago sky the sun was doing what it always did, which was continuing regardless, and the three of them sat on that bench in the cold. And the word that had been locked inside a small person for 3 years was out in the air, and it was not going back.